I'm going to show you how to install coilovers using this set from MaXpeedingRods. I already have my car up on low profile ramps so I can get my floor jack underneath, and my general tools, impact gun with sockets, and torque wrench laid out. Prior to this install, I set a 0 spring load on my front coilovers. Any preload made the rides bouncy at low speeds. In order to set 0 preload, I'm going to first measure the uncompressed spring, which is 7 inches tall. Then I'll raise the perch until the spring doesn't move. That seems snug. I'll give it half a turn just to be safe. Let's remeasure to make sure it's not compressed at all. Perfect. Now to raise the locking ring up all the way. And then I'll take the 2 spanner wrenches and lock it in place like so. Try not to move the perch while tightening. It shouldn't take a whole lot of force to secure them. And there we go. Let's set this one aside, and I'll show you how to easily set a 4mm preload instead. I'm going to loosen the locking ring so I can set this to 0 preload, then bring the locking ring back up, but leave it loose. The spanner wrench is 4mm thick, so I'm going to raise the perch up enough until there's enough gap to fit it in between. Be careful not to move the locking ring while doing this. Perfect. Now to raise the locking ring up, and secure it in place with both spanner wrenches. Again, make sure you don't move the perch while doing this. And done. These coilovers come with camber plates, and I want to make sure my camber is as close to what it currently is until I can get an alignment. So I'm going to measure it using this simple camber tool. It has a knob so you can zero out the bubble level, and a strong magnet for attaching it to the rotor. Now to zero this out. My driveway is not level at all, so I'm just going to apply the same camber plate adjustments on the passenger side until I can get on a perfectly level surface to recheck. I've got the wheels off and the front end on jack stands, and I've already removed the wiper cowl. I'll put a link to the cowl removal guide in my video description below. With that out of the way, I can remove the 14mm nuts from the strut mount and take my strut bar off. I like to replace the nuts loosely afterwards to keep the strut from falling. I have Moog end links, so I can use a wrench to keep it from spinning while I unbolt it. But factory end link owners will need to use a 6mm hex key to keep it from spinning while you use a 17mm wrench to remove the nut. With the end link disconnected, I was then able to use my trim tool to pop out the clip holding the speed sensor wire in place. Now I'm going to use a 14mm socket with a short extension to unbolt the speed sensor and brake line brackets. I've replaced the bolt so I don't lose it. Now to use my 22mm impact socket with my impact gun to remove both the steering wheel knuckle bolts. I've placed my jack under the lower control arm so I can relieve any tension on the bolts. If done just right, you should be able to pull them right out. With the jack still in place, I removed the strut mount nuts. Now to hold onto the strut while I lower the floor jack. Be careful not to damage the speed sensor wire. When you remove the strut, pull it out and away from the wire and brake line. The new coilover is much smaller compared to the McPherson assembly. One thing to note is that the brake line mount has a little tab that may catch on the speed sensor wire or brake line while you're pulling out the strut, so be careful with it. Now to install the coilover and secure it in place with the 3 strut mount nuts. While I tighten down everything, take note of the camber plate orientation. The MaXpeedingRod logo should be towards the back. If you need to remove or tighten down this nut, use a 21mm wrench. To keep the center shaft from spinning, use a 9mm wrench. Do not use an impact gun here or you may damage the piston and that may cause it to eventually leak. I ended up swapping in my factory nuts afterwards. They have a smooth surface underneath compared to the ones the coilovers came with. Also, these will be tightened down to 37 foot-pounds. Before I connect the steering knuckle, let's adjust the height. I'm going to unlock the lower mount ring by turning it counterclockwise. Now to spin the ring all the way up to the top, and then pull the speed sensor wire off to the side, and spin the lower mount up to the top. This is much easier to do when you're not holding a camera. I used my jack to raise the steering knuckle so I could align the holes with the lower mount. It was a little tight, but the bolts fit. Now to use my impact gun to secure the nuts. Follow this up with a 22mm wrench to hold the bolt in place while you tighten the nuts down to 177 foot-pounds. With that secured, let's lock the lower ring into place. And then reinstall the speed sensor clip, and then reattach the brake line and speed sensor bracket. I'll reuse the bolt from the old strut. It was a tight fit, but the bolt's in. Tighten it to 21 foot-pounds. Now the end link won't reach until I disconnect the other side, but this gives you an idea of the height difference. So my iBox sway bar is hitting the frame somewhere, so I can't get the end link to reach. This is going to be way too low for me anyway, so I'm going to adjust the height. Let's unlock the lower ring here. Oh yeah, I finally remembered my gloves. And then I'll slide the ring up a little bit out of the way. I can raise the car by using the spanner wrench on the perch locking ring by turning it counterclockwise, or lower the car by using it on the perch itself and turning it clockwise. Make sure the threads are clean before doing this. Now, this method works since the two rings are locked together and you're rotating them in a manner that just tightens them. If you find it difficult to rotate the threaded shaft, you may need to loosen the steering knuckle nuts. I decided on an 1.5 inch gap. The end link definitely reaches now. Let's get this locked into place. I've got the end link reconnected and have tightened it down to 55 foot-pounds. OEM end links will require that 6mm hex key so that you can tighten the 17mm nut. I've set the driver's side coilover with the same 1.5 inch gap. Now let's pop it in. Driver's side done. With my torque wrench set to 76 foot-pounds, I've reinstalled the lug nuts in a star pattern. Now to lower the car the rest of the way. That should settle a little more once I move the car. I've got my strut bar reinstalled and the nuts re-tightened to 37 foot-pounds. Now let's address the camber. It's a little more positive from before. I'm going to need to jack the car back up and then adjust the camber towards the car. I've loosened all 4 bolts with a 5mm hex key, and now I can slide this back and forth. I'm going to move it in 1 notch, tighten down everything, lower the car, and then recheck the level. That did the trick. I also spread the bolts further apart. There's 4 holes to allow for a wide range of adjustment. Now to duplicate the setting on the other side until I can readjust it on level ground. Now for the rear. First I need to remove my strut bar. I'm going to use my new pass-through socket wrench with a 17mm socket on the nut, and a 6mm hex socket with my 19mm wrench to stop the piston shaft from spinning. I'm leaving the nut loosely on top to keep the shock from dropping. I've got the wheels off and the rear end on jack stands. Now to crawl underneath and remove the 14mm nuts from the rear end links with a deep socket. Next, I removed both suspension member braces with a 12mm socket and a short extension. Now for these 17mm bolts. I'm going to hit them with my impact gun on this side, while I use a 17mm wrench to keep the nuts from spinning on the other side. With the nuts off, it's time to use my jack to lift the lower control arm to relieve the tension on the bolts so I can pull them out. I'll have to mess around with the height to find the sweet spot. Once I got it to the right height, both bolts just slid right out. Now to lower the control arm so I can pull out the spring. And there goes the upper isolator. The rear is definitely much easier than the front. I've loosely secured the shock in the lower control arm so that I can come around to the top and finish unbolting it without it just falling right out. With the shock removed, it's time to install the perch. I've taken the giant washer off from the bottom and I've already locked the perch rings into place. I decided to go with a 1/2 inch gap. I used a little bit of spray lube to make it easier to partially press the perch into the opening in the lower control arm. I bolted the washer into place to help seat it the rest of the way. I only did this bolt hand tight. I need to transfer the upper isolator ring to the new spring. The bottom one is not used. Now to set the spring on top of the perch. Just like the stock springs, index the end of the bottom coil so it faces the wheel. I'll show you that in a second after I use my jack to raise the lower control arm just enough so I can seat the top of the spring in place. This is how the bottom of the spring should look like. You want to raise the lower control arm just high enough so the end sits flush. This will be 0 preload. Now to install the shock. I've taken the top nut, washer, and top rubber isolator off. It just needs to reach up into that hole. I'm going to reinstall the bolt to secure the bottom of the shock to the lower control arm, and then spin the threaded section to raise the upper mount. You can see how much I had to raise the threaded section. You want it all the way up to the top without compressing the piston. Now to install the upper isolator. followed by the washer, and now the nut. I'm going to tighten the nut with my 19mm wrench while using an 8mm wrench to keep the piston from spinning. The factory nut is tightened to 18 foot-pounds, so I'm going to do the same for this. I've lowered the jack and confirmed that the spring end is still sitting flush on the perch with the shock fully extended. If it wasn't flush, I would need to shorten the shock. Now to spin the locking ring all the way down and then lock it into place with the spanner wrench. This is the tricky part. I used my jack to line up the holes and then a screwdriver to make sure it was centered and straight. Let's see if I'm lucky. Not quite. I'll have to play around with this a little bit or possibly use a hammer to help tap the bolt in. While using a wrench on the nuts on the other side, I tightened both these bolts to 66 foot-pounds. Now I just need to repeat the same process on the other side. Both sides are done. Now to reattach the end links. Make sure the upper isolator is centered in the opening, and then put the lower isolator and washer on like this and tighten the 14mm nut to 22 foot-pounds. Reattach both suspension member braces and tighten all 6 12mm bolts to 24 foot-pounds. Once this is done, it's time to reinstall the wheels and put the car back on the ground. It's already sitting lower now that I've rolled the car off the ramps. Hopefully I don't have any problems lugging things around with the back this slow. I've got my rear strut bar reinstalled, and now I'm going to make sure all my damper settings are turned all the way to the left, which is the softest setting. I'm just going to do a short test drive to make sure there aren't any problems, and then I'll start adjusting the damper settings. If the ride is too bouncy, I'll adjust all the dampers up one notch at a time until I can find the best setting for day-to-day driving. I just finished driving around for about an hour and had no weird noises or issues. I ended up setting all my dampers to 2 clicks. Now to reinstall the wiper cowl per my guide linked in the video description below. It's been a little more than a week since I installed the coilovers, and I'm pretty happy with the sight and the ride quality. I heard no noises when turning, and there's no signs of leaks. Now that the springs have settled, I can bring it in for an alignment. The back looks good, and I haven't had any problems lugging around heavy equipment. Again, no signs of leaks. I hope this helps you out if you're wondering how to install coilovers on your 2nd gen TC. If you haven't hit subscribe to my channel yet, please do so now, and as always, thank you for watching.